Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Suburban Proletarian. It is Monday, October 10th. It's Indigenous Peoples Day, so as a overpaid and underworked government employee, I've got the day off, and I do have some tasks which have been laid out by my wife that need to be accomplished today. But I had an idea this morning, and I don't know, this might be the most brilliant idea I've ever had, probably not, or it might be the stupidest idea I've ever had. I'm certainly not trying to spark any type of political debate. I guess we'll find out in the comments section down below. But I've seen some online discussion forum posts recently, and I've also been engaged in a conversation with a viewer in the comment section on one of my earlier videos. And it's put me in mind of the challenges that have been faced by indigenous hunters, particularly here in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm much less familiar with what goes on in places like Africa and Australia, although I have some knowledge. I do a lot of reading. But the fact is, and again, I'm not trying to spark any type of political debate, I think it's undeniable that indigenous peoples all over the world have been marginalized and have experienced various types of inequities. They've been marginalized socioeconomically as well as geographically. They're oftentimes, over the years, have been pushed to the fringes of society and forced to live in places which people like me, who have enjoyed all kinds of cushiness in my life, would find rather inhospitable. And this has caused two things that I can think of off the top of my head that affect specifically indigenous hunters. And I'm not necessarily talking about today, although I'm sure a lot of these things still apply. Certainly, there are plenty of indigenous people who have done very well for themselves and are, not economically disadvantaged anymore. But I'm talking about traditionally, specifically in North America, and specifically looking at maybe the last 100 years or so, maybe 150 years. For a lot of indigenous people living in very remote areas, I'm thinking specifically of Alaska and Canada, have had to hunt to subside all year round, not just to feed their families, but to clothe their families and to house their families. So a lot of times they aren't always able, or they haven't always been able to avail themselves of the very, very best tools for the job. They had to make do with what they had. So from the perspective of the Suburban Rifleman, and in recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day, I went through my collection and picked out a small selection of rifles that are, I would say, typical of those that you might have seen or might still see today indigenous hunters using. I'm specifically focusing on North America, Canada, Alaska, but also, and probably to a smaller degree, Mexico. But also, I have something here that would probably be found in the former Soviet Union and maybe even in Finland in the hands of indigenous hunters. Now, I thought about going to the range today. I'm having trouble finding my range card. Surprise, surprise. And second of all, on Mondays, these Monday bankers holidays, which I oftentimes think, well, this would be a great time to go out and shoot a video. Nobody will be at the club. I have the day off. It's usually World War III over there. So in lieu of going and shooting at the club today, we're just going to take a look at these rifles. I'm not going to get super in depth. We've looked at every single one of these before on the channel, and I will splice in some shooting footage as appropriate as I'm talking about these rifles. So I think we'll start off first and foremost with the Winchester Model 94. This is a rifle which needs no introduction. This one's chambered in, well, it says on the barrel 30 Winchester centerfire. Most of us would know it more commonly as 30-30 Winchester. One of the works of John Browning. John Browning produced an enormous number of different firearms designs, many of which have become absolutely iconic. John Moses Browning's maybe the most important firearms designer of ever, I guess. And but I would say that of all of his designs, even when I take into account the 1911, which I think very highly of, and the various Browning machine guns and other firearms that he's designed, the Winchester Model 12 shotgun, the Winchester 1897 shotgun, I think I have that correct. If I don't, I'm sure somebody will correct me. Probably my amigo Guapo. And by the way, Guapo, I pulled this off the bookshelf just for you. I've got another one back there. This one's issue 21. I think I have issue 23 on the shelves as well. But of all those designs, in my mind, the Winchester Model 94, and I love some of those others, and we all have our favorites. I'm not trying to start an argument here, but to my taste, the Winchester Model 94 is the most perfect John Moses Browning design. It just feels perfect in the hand. I'm not walking back my assertion, my earlier assertion that the Marlin Model 336 is still my favorite rifle and my favorite 30-30, but it's kind of dependent on what I happen to have in my hands at the time, and I can tell you that the Winchester 94 is just perfectly balanced. It's very easy pointing, very easy shooting, and of the rifles that we're looking at today, this is the only really proper sporting rifle, commercial sporting rifle that we're going to be taking a look at today. And this was not a cheap rifle. They were made in enormous numbers. It's extremely common. It's beautifully manufactured, and I don't think they were super cheap. This probably would have been the most expensive option for a lot of hunters in Canada and Alaska, but you will certainly have seen many, many of these in use and still being used today. And in light of the conversation I've been having with a viewer in the comments section on another video, these have been pressed into service to kill, and as is the case with all of the rifles we're going to look at today, to harvest all manner of North American game, certainly moose, but even dangerous game like grizzly bears and polar bears, and some animals that are just almost unimaginably enormous unless you see them, like walruses and whales even. So the Winchester 94 has been very, very popular. The 30-30 cartridge has been very, very popular. I'm going to splice in some footage of me shooting the 30-30, but not this rifle specifically. The footage that you see, which is the only footage I happen to have, will be of me shooting my Marlin 336. So the next rifle I want to look at has been extremely popular throughout North America. They're sort of indigenous to Canada. The rifle itself is indigenous to Canada, and they've been sold in enormous numbers in the United States. And I'm talking about the Lee Enfield rifle. There's a whole series of these, and I'm not going to get into all the marks and stars and everything else. This one is a number 4 Mark I. I probably have a rifle that would have been slightly better example for the topic of this video, but this one looks an awful lot like a sporting rifle. Many of these were used in Canada in their original military configuration. Make no mistake about it, this rifle started life as a military rifle, and at some point in time along the line it was converted into a pretty decent looking sporter. Somebody did a nice job of cutting and welding the magazine to shorten it down to 5 rounds. It's in a very nice piece of walnut. I think this is either an E.C. Bishop or Reinhard Fagen stock. Bishop. This is an E.C. Bishop stock, and somebody clearly did a lot of work to turn this into a hunting rifle. But you can see these being used in much the same way as the Winchester Model 94, all over Canada and Alaska, and again being used against all sorts of game. Of course, this one chambers the .303 British cartridge. There's been sort of a cottage industry, particularly in places where commercial rifle actions or commercial sporting rifles haven't been available. There's been a cottage industry of wildcatting the .303 British cartridge. You see that especially in places like Australia and South Africa. South Africa has its Musgrave rifles and a whole host of cartridges that went with that, which are mostly based on the .303 British cartridge case, and it's also been wildcatted extensively in Australia. I don't know about Canada, and I think from the perspective of most indigenous hunters, you're going to see these rifles most often in their original .303 British configuration. I don't know if I have any footage of me shooting a .303 British. If I do, I'll splice it in. So that's the first military conversion of or the sporter type conversion of a military rifle. Another one which has been very popular here in North America has been the Krag Jorgensen. This is I'm not sure exactly which model this is. It says it's the model 1898, so it's a model 1898. I know this one was made in 1902. At some point, and this did start life as a full-length infantry rifle. At some point in time, probably the 1920s, it was shortened. This is not a sort of Krag carbine clone as was done by Bannerman's and a couple other companies. This was actually intended as a very, very basic sporting rifle conversion. I have a whole video on that elsewhere. The work on this rifle was done by R.F. Sedgley in Philadelphia, not very far from here. It is chambered in the original 30-40 Krag. Now, the Krag rifle had a tragically short service life. I think, and you can correct me again, I think the only service rifle that we've ever fielded which had a shorter service life than the Krag was probably the M14. The Krag was in service. Basically, the only combat that it saw was the Spanish-American War, the Philippine insurrection, might have been used in a couple of other little Banana Republic conflicts. But by World War I, this was completely obsolete. And I think it was only made from the mid-1890s up till about 1905, perhaps. I might be wrong about that. Correct me again if I am. But this was a very popular sort of rifle because it was used for such a short period of time, and because most of them really didn't see that much action. There was a ton of these dumped onto the surplus market, most of them in really excellent condition. This one is a little bit worn on the outside, and it's had a bit of rust and wear over the years, but actually internally this rifle is practically brand new. All of the internal parts, I took this apart recently and I detail stripped it and cleaned every single thing, lubed everything and put it all back together, and it's really in remarkable condition. But these have been used all over the American West, certainly in Alaska as well. I don't know about if they were used at all in Canada. I imagine some of them made it across the border, but I don't know that 30-40 Krag was a particularly popular or easy to get cartridge in Canada. But at one point in time, this was one of the most popular sporting cartridges in the United States. It was loaded by every cartridge manufacturer. So, from the perspective of indigenous hunters in North America, those are pretty much what I've selected. I do have a fourth selection here, and this doesn't really apply to North America, but it does apply to the former Soviet Union. And although this particular model probably didn't end up in Finland, the Mosin-Nagant action has been certainly used in Finland. And the 7.62 by 54 rimmed has been extensively wildcatted in Finland as well. So much like the .303 British, in various portions of the British Commonwealth. This is my Model 9159. I did a very long video on that, and I don't want to get too far off in the weeds, but there is a lot of speculation about where this rifle came from, whether it was made in Bulgaria, whether it was converted in the 1990s in Russia by people that were trying to make money selling surplus. One of the most convincing arguments I've seen is that these were converted in the 1950s by the Soviet government to equip commercial hunters. The Soviet government actually sent people out into Siberia, out into the hinterlands to hunt game to provide meat and furs for the market, for the commercial market. And the Soviet government grub-staked these guys. They paid their bills. They flew supplies into them with helicopters to keep them going. And this may very well be one of the rifles that with which they would have been equipped. It's a conversion of a Model 9130. Again, I've talked about this at some length elsewhere, so I'm not going to get too far off in the weeds. But the 7.62 by 54, like the 303 British and the 3040 Krag, and to a lesser extent the 3030, is perfectly capable of taking any game you could find in the Northern Hemisphere. And the hunters in Russia are facing much the same, particularly up around the Arctic Circle, would be facing much the same sort of game that we would find in Canada or Alaska: polar bears, walruses. A little bit further south in Russia, but still very far north, they would even run into brown bears, not the exact same subspecies as the grizzlies and brown bears we have in North America, but very, very similar. And even some kind of exotic stuff that you might not immediately imagine, like tigers, Siberian tigers, and leopards. The Amur leopard lives in Siberia. So certainly rifles like this would have been pressed into use by indigenous hunters in the Soviet Union and the other polar regions of the Eastern Hemisphere. So that's pretty much all I've got for you guys. I just wanted to do a little something in recognition of Indigenous Peoples Day and recognize some of the challenges that have been faced by indigenous hunters all over the world, specifically the Northern Hemisphere, because that's what I'm most familiar with, and that's what I kind of have rifles to represent. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please consider liking, subscribing. Everything you can do down there in the notification section goes a long way to help me out here. And when I post my next video, I hope to catch each of you then. Later, guys.